want you to think about a story you already know the ending of. A city under siege for 10 years, a stolen woman, a wooden horse, a wall of fire. For most of human history, this was considered exactly that, a story. A magnificent one, but a story. Something the Greeks told each other around fires, the way every culture tells stories about wars that never happened. Then, in 1871, a wealthy German businessman with no formal training in archaeology walked onto a mound in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlık, started digging, and found a city. Not one city, 9. Stacked on top of each other like the rings of a tree, each one built on the ruins of the last, spanning more than 3,000 years. This should have settled the question. Troy was real. Case closed. It didn't settle anything, because finding the city is not the same as finding the war. A city can exist for 3,000 years and burn a dozen times for a dozen ordinary reasons. Earthquakes, accidents, the routine violence of the ancient world, proving that one particular fire in one particular layer was caused by a 10-year siege fought over a stolen queen is an entirely different problem. And the man who found the city made that problem much, much worse. Heinrich Schliemann didn't just excavate Troy. He announced he had found King Priam's treasure, a hoard of gold so spectacular it made headlines across Europe. He smuggled it out of the country in secret. He dressed his Greek wife in the jewelry and photographed her as if she were a Homeric queen reborn. Decades later, archaeologists worked out that the treasure Schliemann attributed to Priam came from a layer of the city more than 1,000 years older than the Trojan War could possibly have happened. He hadn't found Priam's gold. He had found someone else's gold in someone else's city, and told the story he needed people to believe. So here is where we actually stand. There is a real city in a real place that burned in a way consistent with human violence around 1180 BCE, almost exactly the moment ancient tradition says Troy fell. There are Hittite documents from the same region, the same century, that describe a place with a name eerily close to Troy's other name, ruled by a king whose name is eerily close to a name in Homer. And there is a man who discovered all of this while lying about most of it. Separating what's real from what Schliemann wanted us to believe, that's the investigation I want to walk through with you. Let's go through the evidence properly. To understand what Schliemann actually found, you need to understand what kind of man was doing the finding. He was not an archaeologist. There was barely such a thing as a trained archaeologist in 1871. He was a self-made millionaire. He'd built his fortune in the indigo trade, in gold dust during the California gold rush, in wartime military supplies, who had decided, in middle age, that he was going to prove Homer right. He picked Hisarlık on the advice of a British-American amateur named Frank Calvert, whose family had lived in the region for generations, and who had already been digging test trenches on the mound for years, without the money to excavate it properly. Schliemann had the money. He didn't have the patience, the training, or, as it turned out, the honesty. His excavation method was, by modern standards, closer to demolition than archaeology. He cut a massive trench straight down through the mound, tearing through layer after layer of the city he claimed to be looking for, because the layer he wanted was assumed to be near the bottom. In doing so, he almost certainly destroyed evidence from the very layer that later turned out to be the best candidate for Homeric Troy. Then, in May 1873, near the end of that season's dig, Schliemann reported finding an extraordinary hoard. Gold diadems, earrings, thousands of gold beads, silver vessels, bronze weapons, all supposedly found together in a single deposit near what he called Priam's palace. By his own account, He sent his workers away for a lunch break and personally cut the treasure out of the trench wall with a knife, so he wouldn't have to share it with the Ottoman authorities, who were legally entitled to half of anything found. He smuggled it out of Turkey in secret. He photographed his young Greek wife wearing the jewelry, styled as Helen of Troy. He announced to the world's press that he had found the treasure of King Priam, hidden in the final desperate hours before the city fell to the Greeks. It was a sensation. It was also, in every way that matters, false. Later excavation and dating work showed that the layer Schliemann had been digging in, the one he called Troy II, dated to roughly 2400 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Trojan War could have happened, according to any ancient chronology. There was no Priam here. There was no siege, no burning city, no desperate king hiding his gold. There was an entirely different civilization, more than a millennium removed from the story Schliemann was trying to prove. Even the story of the discovery itself has been challenged. Later researchers, working through Schliemann's own diaries and correspondence, found inconsistencies serious enough that some scholars now believe the treasure wasn't found in a single dramatic moment at all, that it may have been assembled from multiple smaller finds over time and presented as one spectacular discovery because a single dramatic story sold better than the truth. This matters enormously for what comes next, because everything the public associates with Troy, the gold, the drama, the certainty, starts with a man who had already shown he was willing to lie for a better story. Which means every claim after this point has to earn its place. Not because Schliemann was uniquely dishonest, but because he set the pattern. Find something old, attach it to Homer, let the myth do the work the evidence can't. So let's set Schliemann's fraud aside and ask a cleaner question. Not, did Schliemann find Priam's treasure? He didn't. But is there any layer at Hisarlık that shows genuine evidence of a violent destruction around the time ancient tradition places the Trojan War? The answer is yes, and the evidence is stronger than most people realize. Archaeologists divide the Hisarlık mound into 9 major layers, Troy I through Troy IX, spanning from the early Bronze Age to the Roman period. The layer most scholars now consider the best candidate for Homer's Troy isn't Schliemann's Troy II. It's a much later layer called Troy 7a. Troy 7a was built on the ruins of an earlier, more impressive city, Troy 6, which had been a wealthy, well-fortified settlement with massive stone walls, destroyed around 1300 BCE, most likely by an earthquake. Troy 7a rose on top of those ruins, but it wasn't a golden age. It was a city bracing for something. The archaeology of Troy 7a reads like a population preparing for a siege. Houses were crammed together inside the walls in a way they hadn't been before. Storage jars, enormous ceramic vessels for grain and water, were sunk into the floors of ordinary houses, not just palace storerooms, as if every household needed to be ready to survive a long confinement. Then, sometime around 1230 to 1180 BCE, it burned. Not a small fire. Excavators have found destruction debris up to a meter deep in places, burned mud brick, collapsed roofs, and scattered through the wreckage, bronze arrowheads, sling stones by the hundreds, and human remains, some of them unburied, left lying in the streets and doorways where they fell. New excavation work published in 2025 added more sling stones to that pile of evidence. Hundreds of small, hand-sized projectiles, the kind of ammunition you stockpile when you're expecting an attack, not the kind you leave behind after a natural disaster. Here's a detail that matters more than it should. Sling stones are cheap and reusable. If a city successfully repels an attack, the defenders go out afterward and collect their ammunition to use again. Finding large quantities of sling stones scattered and abandoned suggests something different. A defeat. The people who might have picked them up were dead, fled, or enslaved. So the physical case for a real, violent end to Troy 7a is genuinely strong. Fire, weapons, unburied bodies, evidence of siege preparation beforehand. This isn't Schliemann's manufactured drama. This is what archaeologists actually dug up, a century after he lied about a different layer entirely. What the evidence cannot tell you is who did it, or why, or whether it has anything to do with a stolen queen named Helen. For that, you need a completely different kind of source, not Greek poetry, Hittite bureaucracy. In our Hittites video, we talked about an empire whose archive of clay tablets rewrote what we knew about the ancient world. Buried in that same archive is something that connects directly to Troy. The Hittites kept detailed diplomatic records of the kingdoms on their western frontier, northwestern Anatolia, the exact region where Troy sits. One of those kingdoms appears repeatedly across more than a century of correspondence. The Hittites called it Wilusa. Linguists noticed something striking about that name decades ago. In the earliest form of Greek, the name for Troy wasn't simply Troia. It also carried an older form, Wilios. Drop the initial D gamma, a sound that later disappeared from Greek entirely, and Wilusa and Wilios line up almost perfectly. On its own, that's linguistics, not proof. But it doesn't stand alone. Around 1280 BCE, the Hittite king Muwatalli II signed a formal treaty with the ruler of Wilusa. We have the text. It survives in multiple copies. The Wilusan king's name is recorded as Alaksandu. In the Iliad, the Trojan prince who starts the entire war by taking Helen has two names. Most of the time, Homer calls him Paris. But occasionally, and this detail is easy to miss if you're not looking for it, he calls him Alexandros. Alaksandu, Alexandros. Same region, similar era. A name that isn't common enough in the ancient world for the resemblance to be nothing. It gets more specific. Other Hittite documents refer to conflict in the region involving a power called Ahiawa, a name most specialists now accept as the Hittite rendering of Achaia, the term Homer uses for the Greeks as a whole. One letter, known as the Tawagalawa letter, describes tension between the Hittites and Ahiawa, specifically over Wilusa. Read plainly, that's a Bronze Age document describing exactly the kind of conflict the Iliad describes. A dispute over the city of Troy involving the Greeks, written not by poets centuries later, but by Hittite scribes recording real diplomatic business in something close to real time. I want to be precise about what this does and doesn't prove. It doesn't prove Helen existed. It doesn't prove a 10-year siege happened, or a wooden horse, or any of the specific events in Homer's poem. The Hittite texts never once mention Helen, a siege, or a horse. What it does show is that Wilusa was a real place, in the right location, contested by the right powers, at roughly the right time, and that at least one of its rulers had a name that Greek tradition would later remember, however imperfectly, as belonging to the man who started the war. One of the most respected Hittitologists working on this material, Trevor Bryce, put the caution better than I can. The less material you have, he warned, the more easily it can be bent to fit whatever conclusion you already want. That warning matters, because what we're about to do next is exactly what he's warning against. Try to see if the fragments add up to something coherent, without letting our desire for a good story do the arithmetic for us. Here's the honest problem at the center of all of this. The Hittite texts describing conflict over Wilusa don't describe one war. They describe at least 3 or 4 separate episodes of tension spanning more than a century, from the reign of Tudhaliya I in the 1400s BCE through the Alaksandu Treaty around 1280 and into later documents describing continued instability. Troy 7a's destruction, meanwhile, happened around 1180 BCE, potentially decades, even a century, after the events described in the Hittite correspondence about Alaksandu. So which war is Homer's war? The Alaksandu-era tension? A later undocumented conflict closer to Troy 7a's actual destruction? Or, and this is the possibility more and more researchers take seriously, is the Iliad not a record of one war at all, but a compressed, poetic memory of multiple generations of conflict in the same region, fused into a single 10-year story by centuries of oral retelling? Homer composed the Iliad roughly 400 years after Troy 7a burned. He was working from oral tradition that had already passed through dozens of generations of storytellers, each one shaping the material, combining episodes, attaching names to events they may never have originally belonged to. If you wanted a mechanism for turning a century of scattered border conflicts into one legendary war with one legendary cause, 400 years of oral tradition is exactly the mechanism you design. There's a further complication. The archaeological destruction of Troy 7a happened during the exact same decades as the wider Bronze Age collapse we've covered in this series, the same window that ended the Hittite Empire, that produced the population movements Egypt called the Sea Peoples, that brought down Mycenaean Greece itself. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if Troy wasn't destroyed by a targeted Greek expedition at all? What if it was simply one more casualty of the same systemic collapse that was already tearing apart every other power in the region? Drought, trade collapse, displaced populations, cities burning up and down the eastern Mediterranean for reasons that had nothing to do with a stolen queen. In that version, the Greeks may still have been involved. Displaced, hungry, desperate populations don't stop raiding just because their reasons for raiding have shifted. But the war wouldn't have been fought over Helen. Helen would be the story that got attached afterward, a human, memorable explanation laid over a catastrophe that was really about climate and systems and things much harder to put into an epic poem. I'm not telling you this is what happened. I'm telling you it's one of several models that fit the evidence we actually have, and that no single explanation currently commands enough consensus to close the case. What is clear is this: the version of the story most people carry around, a single 10-year siege fought entirely over Helen, ending in a wooden horse, is almost certainly a simplification. Not a lie, the way Schlieman's treasure was a lie, something gentler and older. A 300-year history, folded down by poets into a shape a human audience could hold on to. I think about this from Istanbul, a few hours' drive from Hisarlık, on the same strait that Bronze Age ships would have used to sail toward Troy, from the Black Sea grain routes the city likely controlled. Troy's location wasn't an accident. It sat exactly where anyone moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to pass. That's not a detail from a poem. That's geography. And it's the same geography I look at from my window. Whoever fought over Troy, they were very likely fighting over exactly what made this stretch of water valuable then and valuable now. Who controls the passage? Troy leaves us with questions that outlast the specific story of Helen and Paris. How much of what we call history is actually centuries of ordinary conflict, compressed by storytellers into a single dramatic narrative, because that's the version people were willing to remember? How do you separate a real event from the myth that eventually swallows it? Especially once someone like Schliemann has already shown how easily a good story can be manufactured on top of real ruins. And what does it mean that the more carefully we look at Troy, the less it resembles either extreme? Neither pure myth, as scholars once dismissed it, nor the precise historical record Schliemann wanted the world to believe he'd found. The city was real. The fire was real. The Hittite records are real. Whether any of it was ever about a woman named Helen, that's the part the evidence has never been able to answer, and may never be able to. The excavation at Hisarlık is still ongoing, The Hittite archive is still being translated. The questions are still open. The research is still ongoing. The debates are still unresolved. The questions are still open. The investigation continues. If you want to know what the evidence shows next and where it ends, join the excavation.